Imagine planting a garden to honor your late wife, only to watch it be destroyed by your own neighbors in the name of rules. This is the story of Tom Weaver, a 72-year-old war veteran who just wanted peace, but the HOA declared war. What happened next left the entire neighborhood stunned. If you've ever felt powerless against HOA tyranny, this story will hit you hard. Stay till the end, because Tom's revenge didn't just shake the board, it changed the entire community forever. Tom Weaver had lived through things most people couldn't imagine. As a decorated Vietnam veteran, he had spent his younger years in the line of fire, surrounded by the sounds of chaos and the weight of duty. But after decades of service, both in war and in the workforce, all he wanted was peace. When his wife, Mary, passed away after a long battle with cancer, Tom's world changed forever. She had been his anchor, the one who reminded him to breathe when the past came creeping in at night. Without her, the silence in his home was deafening. To cope, Tom turned to his small front yard. Gardening had been Mary's favorite pastime, and though he never took much interest while she was alive, it now felt like a way to be close to her. He began planting flowers, marigolds, lilies, roses, the kind she loved, and soon expanded it into a beautiful memorial space. A white stone bench sat in the center, etched with the words, "Forever in Bloom, Mary Weaver." A small American flag fluttered from a pole beside it. Wind chimes added a gentle melody to breeze. Each element was chosen with purpose, a reflection of love, service, and memory. Tom didn't see this as just a garden. It was his place of healing. He spent hours each morning tending to it with quiet devotion. Neighbors occasionally passed by with kind smiles or comments, admiring the blooms or offering condolences. Children in the neighborhood sometimes stopped to ask about the flag or the plaque. Tom always welcomed the questions. He saw it as a teaching moment, about sacrifice, about honor, about remembering the people who gave everything for something greater than themselves. For a while, it seemed like life had finally found a quiet rhythm again. The garden grew fuller each week, and Tom began adding personal touches. A bronze medallion with his unit's insignia, a small solar light to illuminate Mary's name at night, and wind-carved stones he collected on walks. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't overgrown. It was careful, curated, and deeply meaningful. But not everyone saw it that way. The Homeowners Association, a 5-member board led by Carla Jenkins, a sharp-dressed real estate agent with an obsession for curb uniformity, had a reputation for strict enforcement. Residents whispered about past violations over fence height, mailbox paint color, even the shape of bird feeders. Tom, like many others, had stayed off their radar by keeping his property clean and respectful. But once the garden took shape, it didn't take long for the HOA's attention to turn toward him. One morning, Tom opened his mailbox to find a bright yellow notice with bold letters. Violation. Unapproved landscaping structures. It stated that his front yard garden did not conform to the community's landscape guidelines. No prior warning, no request for a meeting, just a demand that the non-compliant elements be removed within 10 days or face daily fines. Tom was stunned. He read and reread the letter, trying to understand what exactly was in violation. Was it the bench? The flowers? The plaque? He had reviewed the guidelines before starting the garden and had seen no language that prohibited decorative memorials. But the HOA insisted his personal expression disrupted the aesthetic cohesion of the community. He drafted a formal letter in response, respectfully explaining the purpose of the garden. He included photos, a copy of Mary's obituary, and even offered to meet in person to discuss compromises. He assumed they'd understand. Who wouldn't? But a week later, another letter arrived. This time, it wasn't a warning. It was an invoice. $250 for 7 days of noncompliance. It also included a stern warning that continued defiance would result in escalating penalties and potential legal action. Tom's hands trembled as he read the letter. It wasn't just about money. It was about principle, about memory, about respect. He couldn't understand how something so peaceful, something born out of love and loss, could be seen as a violation. Mary's garden had become his refuge, and now it was under attack, not by vandals or thieves, but by people who lived just a few houses down. He thought about removing a few items. Maybe the plaque? Maybe the flag? But every time he tried to imagine doing that, he felt like he was burying her all over again. He wasn't ready to let go. Not now, not like this. So he made a quiet decision. He would not back down. He would keep the garden, the plaque, and the flag exactly as they were. He would honor his wife, no matter what they tried to take away from him. He just didn't know that this garden, his sacred tribute, would become the very thing that would tear the entire neighborhood apart. What began as a peaceful garden tribute soon turned into a quiet battlefield. Tom Weaver had hoped his initial letter to the HOA board would be enough. It wasn't confrontational. It was humble, heartfelt, and clear. He explained the significance of every element in the garden, from the flowers planted in his wife's memory to the American flag honoring the soldiers who never made a home. He thought if they understood the meaning, they'd surely reconsider. But when no response came and the fines kept piling up, it became clear that the board wasn't interested in understanding. They were interested in control. By the second week, the fines had increased from $250 to $500. The violation notices came with more aggressive language, warning that legal steps would be taken if compliance wasn't met. There was no dialogue, no compromise, just pressure. The HOA cited vague rules about non-conforming fixtures, unauthorized structures, and aesthetic disruption to community standards. But none of the citations referenced any specific section of the HOA bylaws. Tom began to suspect they were making it up as they went. Some neighbors started avoiding eye contact. Others, more sympathetic, offered quiet support. A few even whispered that they had received similar treatment for small infractions, like planting roses that were too bright or painting their shutters a shade too dark. Most were afraid to speak up. The HOA board had built a reputation over the years, not just for enforcement, but for retaliation. Residents who pushed back often found themselves buried in code citations or tangled in expensive legal skirmishes. The message was clear: resistance would cost you. Tom had seen intimidation before. In war zones and during his years working in logistics management, he'd faced people who believed authority was a weapon. But this time, the battlefield was his own yard, and the bullets were paper fines backed by petty threats. He didn't want conflict. He didn't want to fight. But he also wasn't going to erase the only thing that gave him peace. Then came the email from Carla Jenkins, the HOA president. It was short, cold, and final. She thanked him for his emotional context, but stated that personal sentiments do not supersede community regulations. The HOA, she wrote, has an obligation to preserve property values and visual consistency. She warned that if the unauthorized memorial wasn't removed in 3 days, the board had the right to contract with outside services to restore compliance, at Tom's expense. It felt like a gut punch. This wasn't about weeds or overgrowth. The garden was meticulously maintained. It had drawn quiet admiration from visitors and neighbors alike. But to Carla and her board, it represented something they couldn't control: individuality. And worse, a challenge to their authority. The garden wasn't just a violation of policy in their eyes. It was a public display of defiance, and that they couldn't tolerate. Tom called a local HOA attorney for advice, but the consultation fee alone was hundreds of dollars. The lawyer confirmed that, unfortunately, many HOAs operate in legal gray areas, protected by technicalities and clauses buried in the fine print of community covenants. Fighting them in court could take months or even years, and most people didn't have the time or money to endure it. That's how these boards stayed powerful, by making it too costly for anyone to stand up. The next week, Tom received another invoice. The total now exceeded $2,000. Along with it came a certified letter stating that if payment was not made in full within 10 days, a lien could be placed on his property. A lien on the house he had paid off 15 years ago. The house he and Mary had bought with savings and dreams. Now, that home was being weaponized against him over a garden planted in love. At night, Tom sat by his window and looked out at the flowers, dimly lit by the solar light next to the bench. It still brought him comfort, but now it was mixed with anxiety. Every car that slowed down out front made his heart beat faster. Was it the landscapers they warned him about? Were they coming with shovels and orders? And still, the HOA board remained silent except for their letters and fines. No one visited. No one called. Not a single board member had spoken to him face to face. They hid behind their formal titles in fine print, enforcing authority without human decency. Tom began documenting everything. He took photos of the garden every day. He saved every letter, every invoice, every email. If they were going to force his hand, he would make sure he had the truth on his side. He didn't have a team of lawyers or a board of enforcers, but he had something else: experience, patience, and a belief that even in a small neighborhood, injustice had to be called out. What the HOA didn't realize was that their relentless pursuit of compliance had just turned a grieving man into a quiet warrior, and they had no idea what he was about to do next. The warnings had come, and Tom had prepared himself for the worst. Still, when it happened, it caught him completely off guard. That morning, he had an early appointment at the VA hospital for his annual cardiac exam. It was routine, one he couldn't skip, and he hated being away from the house even for a few hours with everything going on. Before leaving, he watered the garden just like he always did. A quiet ritual that connected him to Mary and brought him peace despite the storm brewing around him. While he waited for the doctor, Tom's phone buzzed. It was a message from his neighbor, Sharon, one of the few in the neighborhood brave enough to speak up. She sent a single photo followed by a message. "I'm so sorry. They're here." The image showed men in safety vests hauling away his garden. The bench was already gone. The flowers, uprooted and dumped into plastic bins. The flagpole was being unscrewed by two men, while a third directed them, clipboard in hand. Tom stared at the photo, disbelief settling into his chest like a stone. He tried to call Sharon, but she didn't answer. He left the hospital early, skipping the rest of his appointments. The drive home felt longer than usual, his hands tied around the wheel, his mind racing through what might still be left when he got there. But deep down, he already knew. The board had followed through. They hadn't just fined him. They had come onto his property and erased Mary's memory without even knocking on his door. By the time he pulled into the driveway, it was done. The yard was stripped bare. Not a single flower remained. The soil had been flattened, the mulch removed. Even the stones, the small ones Mary had collected on beach trips and walks, were gone. The bench was missing, and so was the plaque. The American flag that once stood proudly in the breeze had been rolled up and tossed aside near a trash bin at the edge of the lawn. There were no workers in sight. Just a single paper posted on his front door, taped without care, titled Compliance Notice, Work Completed. The HOA had billed him for the cleanup. $1,200 for what they called restoration to approved landscaping standards. That amount would be added to the running tab of fines, now totaling over $3,200. The letter warned that if payment was not received within 7 days, legal action and lien proceedings would begin immediately. There was no apology, no mention of the garden's significance, no acknowledgement of the pain they had caused. Tom didn't cry. He couldn't. The hurt was too deep, too raw, to reach his eyes. What hurt the most wasn't just the destruction of the plants or the bench. It was the loss of something sacred, something no HOA meeting could ever understand. That garden had been Mary's second life. It had been his connection to her, his sanctuary, his therapy. And now, in one morning, it was gone. Word spread quickly. Some neighbors walked past silently, too afraid to make eye contact. A few slowed down, shook their heads, and whispered apologies under their breath. Others took photos from their porches and quickly retreated inside. Sharon eventually came over with a thermos of coffee, tears in her eyes. She had tried to stop them, she said. She argued with the workers, showed them a copy of the letter Tom had written to the board, pleaded with them to at least wait until he returned home. But they said they were just following orders. For the next few days, Tom didn't tend to the yard. He didn't write letters or file complaints. He sat on the porch in silence, staring at the empty space where the garden used to be. Every car that passed was a reminder of how powerless he had become in his own home. Every morning felt heavier than the one before. His heart ached in a way he hadn't felt since Mary passed. Then one evening, while organizing his documents, he came across an old folder from when he first moved into the neighborhood. Inside were the original HOA agreements, covenants, and bylaws. As he flipped through them, something struck him. There was no mention of a specific prohibition on memorial gardens, no rule about removable benches, no exact clause against small flags on residential lawns. The language was vague, open to interpretation, and open to challenge. That night, something inside Tom shifted. The sadness gave way to resolve. He had been pushed far enough. The garden may have been gone, but the truth wasn't. The HOA had acted beyond its authority, and he had the documents to prove it. If they wanted to fight, they were about to get one, but not with rage or noise. Tom would do what he had always done: plan, prepare, and strike with precision. What the board had mistaken for compliance was only the calm before the storm. They had taken his garden. Now he was going to take their power. Tom Weaver had never sought conflict, but once it was forced upon him, he knew how to respond. The destruction of his garden had left a deep scar, but it had also awakened something that had long been dormant. The part of him that refused to be silenced, that had learned long ago how to stand against systems that use power without justice. He was no stranger to strategy, and this time the battlefield was legal, digital, and public. He began by organizing everything. He collected every notice, invoice, and email from the HOA. He cataloged photos before, during, and after destruction, as well as messages from neighbors who had witnessed the removal. He printed out the HOA's governing documents, highlighting the vague language and lack of any clause directly prohibiting a memorial garden. Each piece of information became part of a growing case file that Tom built with military precision. Next, he contacted the local Veterans Affairs office. He shared what had happened, how a private HOA had destroyed a memorial garden dedicated to his late wife and fellow servicemen. The office staff, outraged, connected him to a regional veteran advocacy group. They weren't just sympathetic. They were mobilized. They shared his story with their network, and within days, support began pouring in. Messages of encouragement came from across the state. Veterans offered advice, resources, and names of pro bono attorneys who had dealt with abusive HOAs before. Tom also reached out to a local investigative reporter known for covering community injustice. He emailed a detailed summary of events along with photos of the garden, the destruction, and copies of the finds. The reporter called him the next day, asking for an interview. Tom agreed, and by the weekend, the story aired on local TV under the headline, "Veterans Memorial Garden Destroyed by HOA Enforcement." The report included footage of the original garden, the HOA's violation notices, and an emotional clip of Tom explaining why the memorial mattered. The response was immediate. Social media picked up the story. Local pages, veteran forums, and even neighborhood groups began sharing the segment. Comments flooded in, people outraged by the HOA's heartlessness, others sharing their own horror stories of overreach and abuse. The story struck a chord far beyond Tom's community. It wasn't just about flowers or rules. It was about power, memory, and respect. Encouraged by the momentum, Tom created a simple Facebook page, Justice for Mary's Garden. On it, he shared updates, photos, and documentation. He wasn't out for sympathy. He wanted awareness. He posted the original garden design, the letters from the HOA, the cost of fines, and the invoice of the so-called restoration. He didn't have to ask for attention. It came naturally. People were tired of being bullied by faceless boards and hidden rules. Tom had become the symbol of a much larger fight. Within a week, the page had thousands of followers. Veterans from different states shared it. A retired judge even commented, pointing out potential civil rights violations under the Fair Housing Act and federal protections for veteran memorials. A nonprofit legal organization specializing in HOA disputes offered to help. They reviewed Tom's documents and confirmed that several of the HOA's actions were not just unethical. They were likely illegal. Armed with legal support, Tom filed an official grievance with the state HOA Oversight Board. He also began preparing a civil complaint backed by attorneys against the HOA for destruction of private property, emotional distress, and violation of his rights as a homeowner. He didn't want money. He wanted accountability. He wanted the people responsible to explain, in front of a judge, why they thought a grieving widower's tribute was a threat to community aesthetics. But the fight didn't stop in the courtroom. Residents within the HOA community, once quiet and cautious, began to speak up. Inspired by Tom's bravery, they started coming forward with their own stories. One neighbor had been fined for placing a wheelchair ramp without prior approval. Another had been cited for installing solar panels that weren't visually consistent. People realized this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern of abuse. Tom invited them to share their stories on his Facebook page. Soon, the page transformed from a personal campaign into a platform for resistance. It gave voice to homeowners who had felt voiceless for years. The HOA, once emboldened by fear and silence, found itself publicly exposed. Every time they tried to justify their actions, Tom posted receipts. Every time they hid behind policy, someone online posted evidence of selective enforcement. And through it all, Tom never lashed out. He remained calm, factual, and measured. He had learned long ago that dignity could be its own kind of defiance. He didn't need to scream to be heard. He just needed to speak the truth where others could finally listen. What began as a personal loss had become a community reckoning. The HOA had taken a bench and a few flowers, thinking it would end there. But now, they had a public relations disaster, legal trouble, and a united neighborhood asking questions. The board thought they were silencing a man. Instead, they gave him a megaphone. The monthly HOA meeting had never drawn much attention in the past. Typically, a few board members sat behind folding tables, flipping through agendas and checking boxes. Residents rarely attended unless there was something personal at stake. A fence appeal, a tree removal, maybe a driveway extension. But this time, everything was different. Flyers had gone out. Social media was buzzing. Local news stations confirmed their presence. For the first time in years, the room was full. Tom Weaver arrived early. He wasn't alone. Beside him were other residents who had found their voices over the past few weeks. They were armed with documentation, testimonies, and a growing confidence that had been missing in the neighborhood for far too long. What started as a personal garden dispute had uncovered something deeper, a pattern of abuse that the community was no longer willing to ignore. Camera crews set up quietly in the back. Local journalists and veteran groups stood near the entrance, observing. People who had never before spoken publicly had come with statements in hand, ready to support Tom and share their own grievances. Some wore pins representing military service. Others brought photos of their own family members whose homes had been targeted by the board's overreach. The board members took their seats, clearly unsettled by the turnout. Carla Jenkins, the HOA president, scanned the room with a forced smile. What had once been her domain of quiet authority now felt less like control and more like scrutiny. She opened the meeting as usual, following protocol, hoping to steer things quickly through formalities. But no one was interested in small talk or routine updates. Tom stood and asked to be recognized. The room fell silent. Carla hesitated but allowed it. What followed wasn't a speech. It was a presentation. Tom handed out packets to each board member, neatly organized documents that included side-by-side comparisons of the HOA's rules and his actual garden setup. He highlighted the absence of any clause that forbade what he had done. He attached legal opinions from attorneys. He included statements from neighbors and photographs showing the garden before it was removed, clean, respectful, and meticulously maintained. Then he addressed the board's actions, the fines, the destruction of private property, the lack of due process, and the absence of dialogue. He recounted the timeline with precision. He read aloud part of a letter Mary had written to him years earlier, a message about the importance of beauty, memory, and honoring those who serve. The words were simple but carried weight. The room remained quiet, not because people didn't care, but because they did. Others began to speak. Sharon, his neighbor, described the day the garden was destroyed, including how she had tried to intervene. A retired teacher detailed how the HOA had fined her for installing a handrail after her hip surgery. A single mother shared how her request for a backyard vegetable garden was denied, while others were mysteriously approved. The stories kept coming. Each one peeled back another layer of a system built not on fairness, but favoritism and control. One by one, the board members grew uncomfortable. Carla tried to defend the board's actions by referencing standards and consistency, but her words rang hollow in the face of such evidence. A reporter from a local paper asked whether the board could produce records showing consistent enforcement of these standards. Another reporter asked why there was no public appeals process available to homeowners. No clear answers were given. Then came the legal advisor representing the veteran advocacy group. He calmly informed the room that a civil lawsuit had been filed against the HOA, citing property destruction, harassment, and potential violations of federal law, including the Fair Housing Act and protections granted to veterans under state law. He handed each board member a copy of the complaint. Murmurs filled the room. Some board members looked stunned. Others exchanged nervous glances. One, visibly shaken, quietly left the meeting. A second followed minutes later. The silence that followed wasn't just uncomfortable, it was heavy with consequence. The image of unchecked power was cracking in real time. Tom didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice or throw accusations. His presence alone, firm, calm, and deeply human, had done what shouting never could. By standing up, he had given others permission to do the same. And now, the board had no choice but to face the reality of what they'd become. Before the meeting adjourned, a motion was made by a board member to open an internal review of all HOA enforcement actions over the past 2 years. Another proposed suspending all fines currently in dispute pending legal review. Both motions passed. Carla Jenkins, who had once ruled the board unopposed, sat motionless. The gavel in her hand suddenly felt much heavier than it used to. Outside the meeting hall, residents gathered in small groups, exchanging phone numbers, shaking hands, and expressing relief. Something had changed. The fear that once silenced the community had lifted. The HOA wasn't untouchable anymore. The showdown had ended, but the fight for change had only just begun. The weeks following the HOA meeting brought a sense of clarity that the community hadn't felt in years. Where fear and silence once lingered, conversation and action began to take root. Residents who had spent years quietly accepting fines and unfair treatment now walked their streets with a renewed sense of ownership. The neighborhood had finally awakened, and at the center of it all was Tom Weaver, the man who had simply wanted to honor his wife with a garden. The lawsuit moved forward. With the backing of legal experts, veterans advocacy groups, and a growing coalition of residents, the case gained attention beyond the town. Local media continued covering the developments, and the story was picked up by national veteran-focused publications. The pressure mounted on the HOA board, which had gone from being an obscure, behind-the-scenes authority to the subject of public accountability. Faced with mounting legal costs and public scrutiny, 2 board members resigned within a month. A third, under pressure, admitted in a written statement that enforcement decisions had often been arbitrary and lacked proper oversight. The remaining members agreed to enter settlement negotiations rather than face a prolonged court battle that could cost the association hundreds of thousands in legal fees and damages. As part of the settlement, the HOA was ordered to void all fines and fees previously charged to Tom, reimburse him for the destruction of his property, and issue a formal public apology. The settlement also included mandatory transparency measures. All future board decisions regarding enforcement will be subject to homeowner votes and published reports. A new appeals process was to be implemented, giving residents a fair opportunity to challenge board rulings without retaliation or penalty. But perhaps most importantly, the agreement required the HOA to recognize and permit the reestablishment of Tom's Garden, this time with full community protection. The document even cited it as a memorial space honoring military service and community heritage. It wasn't just a win for Tom. It was a precedent. In the following weeks, the garden was rebuilt not by contractors, but by neighbors. People brought shovels, plants, stones, and paint. Families that had never spoken much to Tom now showed up to help. Children planted flowers under his guidance. A local carpenter offered to build a new bench, stronger and wider than the last. A retired artist volunteered to recreate Mary's plaque, this time etched into a polished granite stone. Tom didn't ask for any of it, but he accepted it with gratitude. The garden took shape slowly, and this time it felt even more meaningful. It was no longer a quiet place of grief. It had become a symbol of community resilience, of standing up for dignity, and of the power one voice could have when others finally joined in. On the day the final touches were completed, The neighborhood held a small dedication ceremony. People gathered around the garden as a local pastor said a few words. Veterans in the crowd stood at attention when the new American flag was raised, this time mounted in concrete and protected by HOA agreement. Children placed hand-painted rocks near the flower beds. A choir from a nearby school sang, "America the Beautiful." And there, just beyond the garden's edge, a new sign was installed. Simple, white letters on a dark wood frame. Mary's Garden, in memory of love, service, and the courage to stand. The impact didn't stop at the property line. Inspired by the story, neighboring communities began reevaluating their own HOA practices. Some updated their bylaws to prevent similar abuses. Others hosted open forums to rebuild trust between boards and residents. Tom received messages from across the country, from people who had felt powerless in their own homes, and now saw that change was possible. In the next board election, Tom was nominated by multiple neighbors to serve on the HOA leadership team. At first, he hesitated. He never wanted power, just peace. But after some thought, he agreed to run, not out of ambition, but to ensure that what happened to him wouldn't happen to anyone else. He won the election in a landslide. As the new board president, Tom didn't seek revenge. He led with transparency, fairness, and accountability. He introduced a community review panel, ensured that violations came with respectful warnings and offers for dialogue, and promoted beautification projects that encouraged individuality without disrupting harmony. The neighborhood began to heal, not just because of new rules, but because of a new spirit. Tom continued tending the garden, though now he was never alone. Visitors often stopped by, sitting on the bench, reading the plaque, or simply enjoying the quiet. Some came with flowers of their own, others with stories of loved ones. The space had transformed into something larger than memory. It had become a living message that even when faced with indifference or injustice, kindness, perseverance, and truth could still take root and bloom. What started with a single violation notice ended with a neighborhood transformed. And in the middle of it all stood a veteran, a husband, and a gardener, proving that real strength isn't in how loud you shout, but in how firmly you stand when everyone expects you to fall. Sometimes, standing up starts with something as simple as a flower. Tom never planned to become a leader. He just refused to be erased. If this story moved you, share it with someone who's ever felt powerless in their own neighborhood. Subscribe for more real-life stories of courage, justice, and quiet rebellion. And remember, the strongest roots grow where the fight was hardest.